In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a single sip of coffee brings death. Eleanor Vance, radiant and newly engaged, collapses in the library, her lips stained with poison. Was it the bitter grudge of a spurned lover, a hidden debt from a shadowy past, or a secret buried deep within the manor's walls? Join Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a mind sharper than a blade, as she unravels a web of lies, betrayal, and greed. Who among the guests Charles, the grieving fiancé, Clara, the trembling friend, or the polished solicitor, Roland Finch holds the key to the deadly truth? In the poison plate puzzle, every clue counts, and no one is what they seem. Will you guess the killer before Miss Marple does? Chapter 1. The invitation to Blackthorn Manor. In the waning days of an unusually warm October, the village of St. Mary Mead basked in a deceptive calm. The leaves, burnished gold and crimson, drifted lazily from the ancient oaks, and the air carried the faint sweetness of late apples. Blackthorn Manor, perched on a gentle hill overlooking the village, stood as a monument to an older England, its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows suggesting secrets older than the elms that lined its drive. It was to this grand estate that Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming spinster with a mind sharper than a parson's quill, had been invited for a weekend gathering. The invitation had arrived on Tuesday, penned in the elegant, looping hand of Lady Beatrice Haverford, a widow of considerable wealth and even greater ambition. A small party, the letter had promised, to celebrate the engagement of my dear nephew, Charles Haverford, to Miss Eleanor Vance. Miss Marple, whose acquaintance with Lady Beatrice was slight but cordial, found herself intrigued. The Haverfords were not known for idle gatherings, and the mention of an engagement piqued her curiosity. She had heard whispers in the village, nothing concrete, mind you, but enough to suggest that all was not harmony at Blackthorn Manor. On Friday afternoon, Miss Marple arrived at the manor in a hired car, her modest suitcase packed with practical woolens and a single evening shawl. The gravel crunched underfoot as she stepped out, her keen eyes taking in the scene. The manor's facade was imposing, yet there was a faint air of neglect, peeling paint on the window frames, a cracked urn by the entrance. The butler, a stooped man named Grayson, greeted her with a deference that bordered on unease. "Lady Beatrice is in the drawing room, madam," he said, his voice low, as though reluctant to disturb the house's quiet. The drawing room was a study in opulence. Heavy damask curtains, a gleaming chandelier, and a fire crackling in the grate. Lady Beatrice, a tall woman with silver hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, rose to greet her guest. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could join us," she said, her tone polished but strained. "You know my nephew, Charles, of course." Charles Haverford, a handsome man in his early 30s, stood by the mantelpiece, his dark eyes restless. He bowed stiffly, murmuring a greeting, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers toyed with a cigarette case. Beside him stood Eleanor Vance, his fiancée, a striking young woman with auburn hair and a nervous laugh. Her emerald engagement ring caught the firelight, but her gaze darted to the door as though expecting an interruption. The other guests were an eclectic mix, each introduced with a flourish by Lady Beatrice. There was Dr. Simon Caldwell, a local physician with a weary air and a habit of adjusting his spectacles. Mrs. Lydia Prescott, a widowed cousin of Lady Beatrice, whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper eyes, and Mr. Roland Finch, a solicitor from London, whose polished manners did little to mask his calculating glance. Lastly, there was Miss Clara Dunham, Eleanor's childhood friend, a quiet girl with a habit of twisting her handkerchief into knots. As tea was served, Miss Marple settled into a high-backed chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. The conversation was polite but strained, circling around the engagement and the manor's history. Lady Beatrice spoke at length of the Haverford lineage, her pride evident. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the undercurrents, the way Charles avoided Eleanor's gaze, the way Mrs. Prescott's smile tightened when Clara spoke, the way Dr. Caldwell's hand trembled as he lifted his teacup. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, served at precisely 7 o'clock in the dining room. The long mahogany table gleamed under candlelight, and the meal was exquisite. Consomme, roast pheasant, and a delicate lemon souffle. Yet Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the seating arrangement. Charles sat at one end, Eleanor at his side, but Lady Beatrice had placed herself between them, as though asserting her authority. Roland Finch, seated opposite Miss Marple, spoke little, his eyes flicking between his fellow guests. Clara, pale and silent, barely touched her food. It was during the main course that the first hint of discord surfaced. Mrs. Prescott, her voice cutting through the clink of cutlery, remarked, "I do hope, Charles, that this engagement brings you the stability you so desperately need." The words were veiled, but their edge was unmistakable. Charles flushed, his fork pausing mid-air, while Eleanor's hand tightened on her glass. Lady Beatrice laughed a brittle sound and changed the subject to the weather. Miss Marple, sipping her wine, said nothing but watched everything. She noted the time 7:42 p.m. when Grayson refilled the water jug. She observed the way Clara's eyes followed the butler as he moved, and how Dr. Caldwell excused himself briefly, returning with a faint flush on his cheeks. Small details, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that in such details lay the truth. As the meal drew to a close, Lady Beatrice rose, proposing a toast to the engaged couple. "To Charles and Eleanor," she said, her voice ringing with forced cheer. The guests raised their glasses, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a flicker of something fear, perhaps, in Eleanor's expression. The moment passed, and the party adjourned to the drawing-room for coffee. It was there, at precisely 9:15 p.m., that the evening took a darker turn. A scream high, piercing cut through the murmur of conversation. Grayson, pale as chalk, burst into the room. "It's Miss Vance," he stammered. "She's collapsed in the library." The guests rushed to the library, Miss Marple trailing behind, her steps measured but swift. Eleanor Vance lay crumpled on the floor, her face ashen, her emerald ring glinting in the lamplight. Dr. Caldwell knelt beside her, his fingers seeking a pulse. His expression, as he looked up, was grim. "She's dead," he said quietly. Miss Marple's lips tightened. The air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with shock and suspicion. She glanced at the untouched coffee cup on the table beside Eleanor, the faint smear of lipstick on its rim, the faint bitter scent that lingered in the air. Poison, she thought, her mind already turning. The game, as her old friend Sir Henry Clithering might say, was afoot. Chapter 2. The shadow of Death Library at Blackthorn Manor was a cavernous room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of stern-faced Haverfords. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax, now tinged with that faint, bitter odor Miss Marple had noted. Eleanor Vance lay still on the Persian rug, her auburn hair fanned out like a halo, her emerald ring catching the lamplight. The guests stood frozen, their faces a tableau of shock, grief, and Miss Marple's keen eyes detected something akin to fear. Dr. Simon Caldwell, still kneeling beside the body, rose slowly, his spectacles glinting as he adjusted them. "It's no use," he said, his voice steady but strained. "She's gone. I suspect. Poison." The word hung in the air, sharp and accusing, and a murmur rippled through the small crowd. Lady Beatrice, her face pale beneath her powdered composure, clutched the back of a chair. "Poison," she echoed, her voice trembling with indignation. "In my house. Impossible." But her eyes darted to the coffee cup on the side table, its contents untouched save for that telltale smear of lipstick. Charles Haverford, his face ashen, pushed forward, dropping to his knees beside his fiancée. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This can't be." His hands hovered over her, as though afraid to touch her, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in his fingers, the way his gaze flicked briefly to the others before returning to Eleanor's still form. Mrs. Lydia Prescott, standing near the fireplace, let out a sharp tsk. "Well, this is a fine scandal," she said, her tone cutting. "Engaged one moment, dead the next. What will the village say?" Her eyes, bright with something Miss Marple could not yet name, scanned the room, lingering on Clara Dunham. Clara, pale and trembling, clutched her handkerchief, her eyes wide with horror. She was fine at dinner, she whispered, almost to herself. She was laughing, she was. Her voice trailed off, and she swayed slightly, as though she might faint. Roland Finch, the solicitor, steadied her with a hand on her arm, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the door, took it all in, the positions of the guests, the untouched coffee cup, the faint scratch on the table beside it, the way Grayson the butler hovered at the edge of the room, his face a mask of professional detachment. She noted the time, 9:18 p.m., and the fact that the library windows were closed, the heavy curtains drawn. No draught, no easy escape for that bitter scent. "Someone must fetch the police," Lady Beatrice declared, her voice regaining its imperious edge. "Grayson, telephone Inspector Craddock at once." Grayson nodded and slipped from the room. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the coffee cup again. She stepped closer, her movements unobtrusive, and bent slightly to examine it. The lipstick mark was distinct, a soft rose shade that matched Eleanor's lips. The coffee, black and unsweetened, had a faint sheen, as though a film of oil floated on its surface. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She straightened, her knitting bag still tucked under her arm, and caught Dr. Caldwell's eye. "Doctor," she said softly, her tone deceptively mild, "you mentioned poison. What makes you so certain?" Caldwell hesitated, glancing at the others before answering. "The symptoms," he said. "Her pallor, the sudden collapse, the faint bitter smell. It's consistent with certain substances. Cyanide, perhaps, or something similar." His voice was clinical, but Miss Marple noted the slight quiver in his hands as he spoke. "Cyanide," Miss Marple repeated, almost to herself. "How very precise." Her eyes flicked to the coffee cup, then to the faces around her. Charles, still kneeling, looked up sharply, as though the word had struck him. Clara let out a small gasp, and Mrs. Prescott's lips tightened into a thin line. Lady Beatrice, regaining her composure, clapped her hands. "We must not jump to conclusions," she said firmly. "The police will handle this. In the meantime, no one is to touch anything in this room. Is that clear?" The guests murmured their assent, but Miss Marple's mind was already at work. Cyanide, if it was indeed the poison, acted swiftly within minutes, sometimes seconds. Eleanor had been alive and well at dinner. laughing nervously at 7:40 p.m. When Grayson refilled the water jug, she had been seen in the drawing room afterward, sipping her coffee at around 8:50 p.m. According to Clara's whispered recollection, the collapse had occurred at 9:15 p.m., a narrow window. Miss Marple thought, for such a deadly act. As the guests began to disperse, urged by Lady Beatrice to retire to the drawing room, Miss Marple lingered. She approached the coffee cup once more, careful not to touch it, and noted a small detail. A single crumb, no larger than a pinhead, on the saucer. It was pale, almost white, and did not match the dark biscuits served with the coffee. She filed this away, along with the memory of Grayson's brief absence during dinner, Dr. Caldwell's flushed return, and Clara's nervous twisting of her handkerchief. In the drawing room, the atmosphere was stifling. Charles sat in a corner, his head in his hands, while Lady Beatrice poured brandy with a trembling hand. Mrs. Prescott paced, muttering about the disgrace, while Roland Finch stood by the window, his back to the room. Clara, seated on a sofa, stared blankly at the fire, her handkerchief now a crumpled knot. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "A terrible tragedy," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention. "But I wonder, did anyone notice Miss Vance's behavior this evening? Was she perhaps unwell before dinner?" The question hung in the air, and Miss Marple watched the reactions. Charles's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "She was fine," he said sharply. "Perfectly fine." "Was she?" Mrs. Prescott interjected, her tone laced with skepticism. "She seemed nervous to me, fidgety." "Not at all," the blushing bride, Clara's voice, barely audible, cut in. "She was excited about the engagement," she said. "She told me so this afternoon. But she did say something odd. She mentioned a letter she'd received. She wouldn't say more, but it upset her." "A letter?" Lady Beatrice's voice was sharp. "What letter? From whom?" Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "She didn't say. Only that it had come this morning." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. A letter, she thought. A small detail, but one that could mean everything. She glanced at Roland Finch, who had turned from the window, his face impassive but his eyes alert. Dr. Caldwell, meanwhile, was staring into his brandy glass, as though it held the answers to the night's horrors. The distant sound of a car on the gravel drive announced the arrival of the police. Inspector Craddock, a competent but unimaginative man, would soon take charge, Miss Marple knew. But already, her mind was weaving a pattern from the threads of the evening. The coffee cup, the crumb, the letter, the nervous glances. Someone in this room, she was certain, knew more than they were saying. And Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet ways and her little gray cells, intended to find out who. Chapter 3. The rival of inquiry. Drawing room at Blackthorn Manor seemed to shrink under the weight of impending scrutiny as the sound of boots on gravel heralded the arrival of Inspector Craddock. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 9:45 p.m., its chimes cutting through the strange silence. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm, her eyes missing nothing. The guests, scattered about the room, were a study in unease. Charles Haverford's hands clenched and unclenched. Mrs. Lydia Prescott's lips pursed in disapproval, and Clara Dunham's tear-streaked face betrayed a fragile composure. Lady Beatrice, ever the hostess, straightened her shoulders as the door opened, but even her formidable presence could not mask the tremor in her voice. As she greeted the newcomers, Inspector Craddock, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air, entered with a young constable in tow. His weathered face, lined from years of dealing with St. Mary Mead's occasional dramas, surveyed the room with practiced detachment. "Good evening, Lady Beatrice," he said, his tone formal, but not deferential. "I understand there's been a tragedy. Miss Eleanor Vance, is it?" Lady Beatrice nodded, her silver hair catching the firelight. "In the library, Inspector. A dreadful shock. Dr. Caldwell believes it may be poison." The word, spoken again, seemed to tighten the air further. Craddock's brow furrowed. "Poison, you say? That's a serious matter." He turned to the constable, a nervous young man named Harris, and muttered instructions to secure the library. Then, addressing the room, he said, "I'll need statements from everyone present. No one is to leave the manor until we've sorted this out." "Understood." A murmur of assent followed, though Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in Roland Finch's eyes and the way Dr. Caldwell adjusted his spectacles yet again. She tucked these observations away, her mind already sifting through the evening's events like a gardener turning soil. Craddock began with Lady Beatrice, who recounted the evening with crisp efficiency. Dinner at 7 p.m., coffee in the drawing room at 8:30 p.m., Eleanor's collapse at 9:15 p.m. "We were all here," she concluded, gesturing to the guests. "No one left the drawing room until Grayson brought the news." "Is that so?" Craddock asked, his pen scratching in his notebook. "And who served the coffee?" "Grayson, of course," Lady Beatrice replied, a touch of impatience in her voice. "Our butler. He's been with us for years." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Grayson, she recalled, had been absent for a moment during dinner, returning just after Dr. Caldwell's brief absence at 7:40 p.m. She made a mental note to inquire further about the butler's movements. Craddock moved on to Charles Haverford, whose grief seemed to mingle with agitation. "Eleanor was fine at dinner," he insisted, his voice hoarse. "She was herself, a bit quiet, perhaps, but nothing unusual. We were in the drawing room afterward, all of us, until she went to the library. I don't know why she went there." "Alone? Alone?" Craddock raised an eyebrow. "No one saw her leave?" Clara Dunham spoke up, her voice trembling. "I saw her slip out, Inspector. It was about 9 p.m. She said she wanted a book to read before bed. I offered to go with her, but she said she'd only be a moment." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she twisted her handkerchief tighter. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. 9 o'clock, she thought. That left a 15-minute window before the scream. Enough time for someone to follow Eleanor, to tamper with her coffee. 2. Her thoughts trailed off as Craddock turned to Dr. Caldwell. "You suspected poison." "Immediately, Doctor?" Craddock asked, his tone probing. Caldwell nodded, his face pale. "The symptoms were unmistakable. Rapid collapse, cyanosis, that bitter almond-like smell. I've seen it before, in my practice. It's likely cyanide, though we'll need a post-mortem to confirm." "Cyanide?" Craddock repeated, jotting it down. "Fast-acting, isn't it? How would it have been administered?" "The coffee, most likely," Caldwell said, glancing at the others. "She was drinking it in the drawing room, and the cup in the library was hers. The lipstick mark matches." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The coffee cup again, she thought. That faint sheen, the crumb on the saucer. She made a mental note to examine the tray from which the coffee had been served. If it was still intact, Craddock continued his rounds, questioning Mrs. Prescott, who offered little beyond sharp-tongued observations about Eleanor's nervous disposition, and Roland Finch, who claimed to have noticed nothing unusual, his solicitor's composure unshaken. Grayson, summoned from the hall, confirmed he had served the coffee and cleared the dinner plates. His demeanor impeccable, but his eyes guarded as Craddock wrapped up his initial inquiries. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Inspector, might I ask if the coffee tray has been examined? The one from which Miss Vance's cup was taken." Craddock blinked, momentarily thrown by the interruption from the unassuming old lady in the corner. "The tray, not yet, but we'll get to it. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely a thought," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "It's often the smallest things that tell the largest stories, don't you find?" Craddock grunted, clearly unaccustomed to such cryptic remarks, and moved on to instruct Constable Harris to seal the drawing room and library. The guests were told to remain in the manor, their rooms assigned for the night under the watchful eye of a second constable, who had arrived with reinforcements. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting tucked away. She approached the coffee tray, still on a side table in the drawing room, untouched by the police thus far. 6 cups remained, 5 empty, 1 half full. She noted the sugar bowl, its lid slightly askew, and a small silver spoon with a faint white residue on its handle. Not sugar, she thought, her mind racing. Something else. She glanced at the clock. 10:15 p.m. and made a mental map of the evening's timeline. Dinner at 7 p.m. Grayson's absence at 7:40 p.m. Coffee served at 8:30 p.m. Eleanor's departure to the library at 9 p.m. Her collapse at 9:15 p.m. The poison, if it was cyanide, had acted swiftly. But how had it reached her cup? And that letter Clara mentioned, where was it now? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by Lady Beatrice, who approached with a strained smile. "Miss Marple, you must be exhausted. Shall I have Grayson show you to your room?" "Thank you, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "But I wonder, might I have a word with Grayson before I retire, just to clarify a small detail about the coffee service?" Lady Beatrice's smile faltered, but she nodded. "Of course, I'll send him to you." As the lady of the manor swept away, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind as busy as her needles had been. The poison, the letter, the crumb, the trage, a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to weave. Inspector Craddock would do his duty, but Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the subtle contradictions of human nature, in the glances and gestures that betrayed the heart. And in Blackthorn Manor, she suspected, the heart of this mystery was darker than anyone yet realized. Chapter 4. The threads of inquiry. Drawing room at Blackthorn Manor had grown oppressively quiet, the fire now reduced to glowing embers. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 10:30 p.m., its soft ticking a stark contrast to the tension that lingered like a fog. Miss Jane Marple sat in her corner, her knitting bag at her side, though her needles remained still. Her eyes, bright and unyielding behind her spectacles, followed Grayson as he entered. Summoned at her request, the butler's face was a mask of professional calm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hands clasped tightly before him. "Thank you for coming, Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but precise. "I won't keep you long. I merely wished to clarify a detail about the coffee service this evening." Grayson inclined his head, his expression impassive. "Of course, madam. How may I assist?" "You served the coffee in the drawing room at approximately 8:30 p.m., did you not?" she asked, her tone conversational, as though discussing the weather. Yes, madam, Grayson replied. I brought the tray from the kitchen at 8:30 precisely. Lady Beatrice is particular about the timing. And you poured the coffee yourself? For each guest. Grayson hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. I poured for most. Madam. Miss Vance took her own cup from the tray. She preferred it black, with no sugar. I placed the tray on the side table afterward. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the tray, still undisturbed on the table. And did you notice anything unusual? A spill, perhaps, or someone lingering near the tray? Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. No, madam. Everything was in order. I returned to the kitchen shortly after serving. Thank you, Grayson, Miss Marple said, offering a small smile. You've been most helpful. As the butler withdrew, Miss Marple's mind turned over his words. Miss Vance took her own cup. A small detail, but one that shifted the possibilities. If Eleanor had selected her cup herself, the poison could not have been placed in a specific cup beforehand, unless someone had tampered with the entire pot. But that would risk poisoning others. An unlikely scenario given the precision of the crime. No, Miss Marple thought. The poison was meant for Eleanor alone. Inspector Craddock, who had been conferring with Constable Harris in the hall, re-entered the drawing room. His face was grim, his notebook now filled with scribbled notes. Miss Marple, he said, approaching her, you seem to have a knack for asking questions. Care to share what's on your mind? Miss Marple's smile was disarming. Oh, Inspector, I'm merely an old woman with a habit of noticing things. But I wonder, have you examined Miss Vance's belongings? Clara mentioned a letter that upset her this morning. It might be worth a look. Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. A letter, you say? We'll search her room. Harris, he called to the constable, who scurried over. Check Miss Vance's bedroom. Look for any letters, notes, anything out of the ordinary. As Harris hurried off, Miss Marple turned her attention to the other guests, who had gathered in uneasy clusters. Charles Haverford stood by the window, staring into the darkness, his shoulders hunched. Mrs. Lydia Prescott sat stiffly, her sharp eyes darting between the others. Roland Finch, the solicitor, had taken a seat near the fire, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Clara Dunham, still clutching her handkerchief, seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Marple rose, moving with quiet purpose to the coffee tray. She bent to examine it again, careful not to touch anything. The silver spoon with its faint white residue caught her eye once more. She leaned closer, noting its position slightly askew, as though it had been used hurriedly. The sugar bowl, too, was curious. Its lid was not fully closed, and a faint dusting of powder clung to its rim. Not sugar, she thought again, her mind racing back to Dr. Caldwell's mention of cyanide. Could it be so simple? Yet the simplicity of it troubled her. Cyanide was fast-acting, yes, but it required opportunity and nerve. Inspector, Miss Marple called softly, gesturing him over. This spoon, have you noticed it? There's a residue, not unlike sugar, but perhaps not sugar at all. Craddock frowned, peering at the spoon. You think it's the poison? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that it's worth testing. And the sugar bowl, too. It's possible someone used it as a convenient hiding place. Craddock nodded, signaling to Harris, who had returned empty-handed from Eleanor's room. Bag the spoon and the sugar bowl, he ordered. And be careful about it. As Harris moved to comply, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the timeline. Eleanor had taken her coffee at 8:30 p.m., left for the library at 9 p.m., and collapsed at 9:15 p.m. The poison, if in the coffee, had been ingested within that half-hour window. But who had the opportunity to tamper with the tray? Grayson had served the coffee, but he claimed to have returned to the kitchen. The tray had remained on the side table, accessible to anyone in the drawing room. And then there was the letter. Clara had mentioned a letter that had upset Eleanor, yet was now nowhere to be found. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Clara, who had begun to tremble again. "Miss Dunham," she said gently, approaching the young woman, "you mentioned a letter. Can you recall anything more about it? The envelope, perhaps, or where Eleanor kept it?" Clara looked up, her eyes wide. It was a plain envelope. I think, white, with her name written on it. She had it in her hand this morning, in the garden. She said it was nothing, but she looked so pale. I thought it might be from someone in London, someone she knew before Charles. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing this new detail. A letter from London, perhaps from a past acquaintance. It could be a motive or a distraction. She glanced at Charles, whose face had darkened at Clara's words. Did he know of this letter? Or was it news to him, too? Before she could press further, Constable Harris returned, his face flushed. "Inspector, we found something in Miss Vance's room. Not a letter, but this." He held up a small vial, stoppered with a cork, containing a trace of white powder. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on the vial. "Where was it?" Craddock demanded. "In her jewelry box, sir, tucked under a velvet lining." Miss Marple's lips tightened. A vial of powder, hidden in Eleanor's room. It was too convenient, too obvious. She thought of her nephew Raymond's stories of village gossip, how often the most apparent clue was a lie, designed to mislead. "Inspector," she said softly, "might I suggest you handle that vial with care? It may not be what it seems." Craddock shot her a curious look but nodded. "We'll have it analyzed. In the meantime, no one leaves this house. I'll need full statements from everyone tomorrow morning." As the guests were dismissed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered, her mind weaving a pattern from the night's fragments. The coffee cup, the spoon, the vial, the missing letter. Each was a clue, but none told the whole story. She thought of the village postmistress, Mrs. Cleet, who always knew who sent what to whom. Perhaps a visit to the post office would shed light on that mysterious letter. For now, though, Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting bag in hand, her little gray cells already at work on the puzzle of Blackthorn Manor. Chapter 5. The web of motif. As the morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Blackthorn Manor, casting pale slats of light across the dining room where breakfast was served. The air was heavy with the scent of toast and coffee, but the usual chatter of a country house gathering was absent. The guests, summoned to dine at 8 a.m., sat in uneasy silence, their faces drawn from a sleepless night. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table, buttered her toast with deliberate care, her eyes moving from one guest to another, noting the small tells of guilt, fear, or calculation. Lady Beatrice presided over the meal with her usual authority, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she poured tea. Charles Haverford, his eyes red-rimmed, pushed his eggs around his plate, untouched. Mrs. Lydia Prescott, her sharp tongue unusually subdued, sipped her tea with a frown. Roland Finch, the solicitor, maintained his polished composure, but Miss Marple caught the way his fingers tightened on his fork when Clara Dunham spoke. Clara herself, pale and fragile, barely looked up from her plate, her handkerchief now a permanent fixture in her hand. Dr. Simon Caldwell, seated beside her, seemed preoccupied, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he stared into his coffee. Inspector Craddock had not yet arrived, though Constable Harris stood watchfully by the door, ensuring no one left the manor. The discovery of the vial in Eleanor's jewelry box had cast a shadow over the house, and whispers of poison confirmed by Dr. Caldwell's initial assessment hung like a pall. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced by the vial's convenient appearance. It was, she thought, too neatly placed, too easily found. In her experience, the truth was rarely so obliging. As the meal progressed, Miss Marple broke the silence with a gentle question, her voice cutting through the tension like a soft breeze. "Mr. Haverford," she said, addressing Charles, "you and Miss Vance were to be married soon, were you not? Had you made many plans?" Charles looked up, startled, his fork clattering against his plate. We hadn't set a date," he said, his voice rough. "Eleanor wanted to wait until spring. She said it would give us time to settle things." His eyes flicked to Lady Beatrice, then away, a gesture Miss Marple noted with interest. "Settle things," Mrs. Prescott interjected, her tone sharp. "What needed settling? I thought this engagement was all but sealed." Her eyes narrowed, and Miss Marple saw a glint of suspicion there, directed not at Charles but at Lady Beatrice. Lady Beatrice's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Lydia, really," she said, her voice icy. "This is hardly the time for insinuations. Charles and Eleanor were devoted to each other, were they?" Mrs. Prescott said, her voice low but cutting. "I heard whispers in the village, you know, about Eleanor's connections in London. Old flames, perhaps." She glanced at Clara, who flinched as though struck. Clara's voice was barely audible. "That's not true," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "Eleanor loved Charles. She told me so. The letter, it wasn't about that." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "The letter again. Miss Dunham," she said softly, "you seem certain it was significant. Did Eleanor share anything else about it? A name, perhaps, or a postmark?" Clara hesitated, twisting her handkerchief. I don't know. She didn't say much, only that it came yesterday morning, and it upset her. She burned it in the fireplace in her room. I think I saw ashes when I visited her yesterday afternoon." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A burned letter, another thread snipped before it could be woven into the pattern. She glanced at Roland Finch, who had remained silent, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Mr. Finch," she said, her tone light, "you're a solicitor, are you not? Did Miss Vance ever consult you about any legal matters? A will, perhaps, or a financial concern?" Finch looked up, his expression guarded. "Miss Vance? No, I never had the pleasure of advising her. My business here is with Lady Beatrice, regarding the estate." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight pause before he answered. The way his fingers stilled on his fork, Dr. Caldwell cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "If I may," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "we should focus on the poison. The vial found in Eleanor's room. Inspector Craddock will have it analyzed, but I'm certain it's cyanide. The symptoms were unmistakable. The question is how it reached her coffee." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "And when?" "The coffee was served at 8:30 p.m., and Miss Vance collapsed at 9:15 p.m. A narrow window. Doctor, would you say the poison was administered during that time?" Caldwell nodded slowly. Cyanide acts quickly within minutes, sometimes seconds, depending on the dose. If it was in her coffee, she must have drunk it shortly before her collapse. Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the tray, the spoon, the sugar bowl. And yet, she said, almost to herself, the tray was accessible to all in the drawing room. Curious, don't you think, that only Miss Vance's cup was affected? The room fell silent, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Lady Beatrice set her teacup down with a sharp clink. Miss Marple, she said, her voice strained, you seem to have a great many questions. Are you suggesting one of us is responsible? Miss Marple's smile was serene. Oh, my dear Lady Beatrice, I suggest nothing. I merely observe. In my experience, the truth often lies in what people choose not to say. Before anyone could respond, Constable Harris announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who entered with a brisk nod. Good morning, he said, his tone businesslike. The vial has been sent for analysis, but preliminary tests confirm Dr. Caldwell's suspicion cyanide. We've also found something else. He held up a small evidence bag containing a single sheet of paper, partially burned. This was in the fireplace in Miss Vance's room. It's damaged, but we can make out a few words. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The letter, she whispered. Craddock nodded. It appears so. The words we can read are debt, promise, and what looks like a signature are. We're working to recover more, but it's delicate work. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Roland Finch, whose face remained impassive, though his fingers had stilled completely. She thought, Roland, or someone else entirely. She recalled the village postmistress, Mrs. Cleet, who had a knack for remembering every letter that passed through her hands. A visit to the post office might be in order, but for now, she focused on the guests. Inspector, she said, her voice mild, might I ask about the coffee pot? Was it tested along with the cup and the sugar bowl? Craddock blinked, caught off guard. The pot? Not yet, but it's in evidence. Why? Oh, just a thought, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. If the poison was not in the sugar or the cup, perhaps the pot itself holds a clue. Craddock made a note, clearly puzzled but unwilling to dismiss her outright. We'll look into it, he said. In the meantime, I'll need detailed statements from each of you about your movements last night, starting with you, Mr. Haverford. As Craddock began his interviews, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need for fresh air. She stepped into the garden, her mind racing. The burned letter, the vial, the spoon, the timeline all pointed to a carefully planned act. Yet the clues were almost too perfect. Someone, she thought, was trying to lead them astray. And in a house full of secrets, where motives tangled like ivy, Miss Marple knew the truth would require patience and a keen eye for the smallest of contradictions. Chapter 6. A clue in the Crump's garden at Blackthorn Manor, bathed in the pale light of a late October morning, was a study in contrasts. Vibrant roses clashed with the somber gray of the manor's stone walls. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, strolled along brilliant orange gravel paths, her steps slow but purposeful. To an onlooker, she might have appeared to be merely enjoying the fresh air, but her mind was as active as ever, turning over the fragments of the puzzle that was Eleanor Vance's death. The burned letter, the vial of cyanide, the coffee tray, and that curious crumb on the saucer all were pieces of a pattern she had yet to fully discern. Miss Marple paused by a stone bench, her eyes drawn to the library window, its heavy curtains still drawn from the previous night. She recalled the scene, Eleanor's lifeless form, the coffee cup with its rose-tinted rim, the faint bitter scent in the air. The crumb, she thought, was particularly intriguing. It was not from the dark biscuits served with the coffee, nor did it match the bread from dinner. A white crumb, almost powdery, on a saucer that held a poisoned cup. It suggested carelessness or perhaps deliberate misdirection. Her reverie was interrupted by the crunch of footsteps on the gravel. Dr. Simon Caldwell approached, his hands thrust into his coat pockets, his face weary. "Miss Marple," he greeted, adjusting his spectacles. "I see you're taking the air. A trying morning, isn't it?" "Indeed, Doctor," she replied, her voice gentle. "Death casts a long shadow, does it not? I was just thinking about poor Miss Vance. You were quick to identify the poison last night. Have you encountered such cases often?" Caldwell's expression tightened, though he masked it with a shrug. "Not often, thankfully. But cyanide is unmistakable its speed, its symptoms. I saw a case years ago, in my early practice. A tragic accident, that one." He hesitated, then added, "This, however, was no accident." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes keen. "No, indeed. The coffee cup, I suppose, is the key. But I wonder, did you notice anything unusual about the tray when you were in the drawing room? A spill, perhaps, or an odd smell?" Caldwell frowned, as though searching his memory. "Nothing I can recall. The tray was as Grayson left it. I took my coffee with sugar, as did most of the others. Eleanor, though, took hers black." His voice faltered slightly, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers twitched in his pockets. "Black, yes," she murmured, "and yet there was a crumb on her saucer. Curious, don't you think, for someone who took no sugar or biscuits?" Caldwell's eyes widened briefly, but he recovered quickly. "A crumb? Likely from the table. These old houses, you know, crumbs get everywhere." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "But I find that small things often tell large stories." She thanked him and continued her walk, her mind turning to the sugar bowl and its faint dusting of powder. Not sugar, she was certain, but something else, something that might explain the crumb back in the manor. Inspector Craddock had set up a makeshift office in the morning room, where he was taking statements. Miss Marple, slipping quietly inside, found him questioning Roland Finch. The solicitor sat with his usual composure, his answers precise and measured. "You were in the drawing room the entire time after dinner, Mr. Finch?" Craddock asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "Indeed, Inspector," Finch replied. "I was discussing estate matters with Lady Beatrice until Miss Vance left for the library. I noticed nothing out of the ordinary." "And you didn't see anyone near the coffee tray?" Finch shook his head. "Not specifically. It was on the side table, accessible to all. I took my coffee and returned to my seat." Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively by the door, spoke up. "Mr. Finch, forgive an old woman's curiosity, but you mentioned estate matters. Were these related to Miss Vance's engagement? Perhaps a dowry or settlement?" Finch's eyes flicked to her, a flash of irritation quickly masked. "No, Miss Marple. My business was with Lady Beatrice, concerning the manor's finances. Miss Vance was not involved." Craddock raised an eyebrow but made a note. As Finch was dismissed, Miss Marple approached the inspector. "Might I see the burned letter fragment, Inspector?" she asked. "I know it's irregular, but I have a knack for noticing things. Craddock hesitated, then handed her the evidence bag. The fragment was small, charred at the edges, but the words debt, promise, and the partial signature were clear. The handwriting was bold, almost aggressive, and the paper was of good quality, not the cheap stationery of a casual note. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A man's hand, I think, she murmured. And the paper suggests someone of means. Have you checked the postmarks at the village post office? Craddock blinked, clearly impressed despite himself. Not yet, but I'll send Harris. You think this letter is key? I think, Miss Marple said, that it upset Miss Vance for a reason. And reasons, Inspector, are often motives. As Craddock moved on to question Clara Dunham, Miss Marple slipped into the library, now cordoned off but accessible with a nod from Constable Harris. The coffee cup remained on the side table, sealed in an evidence bag, but the saucer was still there, overlooked by the police. She bent to examine it, her eyes narrowing at the crumb. It was indeed powdery, almost like a fine dust, and it matched the residue she had seen on the sugar bowl's spoon. Not sugar, not flour, but something deliberate. Cyanide, perhaps, ground to a powder to blend with the sugar. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft gasp. Clara stood in the doorway, her face pale. Miss Marple, what are you doing here? She asked, her voice trembling. Merely looking. My dear, Miss Marple said gently. This crumb, did you notice it last night? On Miss Vance's saucer apple? Clara shook her head, her eyes wide. I don't know. I was so upset. I didn't notice much. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. But you were close to Miss Vance. Did she ever mention anything about difficulties? Financial troubles, perhaps, or someone who might have wished her harm? Clara's lips trembled. She did say once that she owed someone money. In London. She didn't say who, but she was worried about it. She said it was why she wanted to marry Charles so she could be free of it. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A debt, a promise, a letter with the word debt. The pattern was beginning to take shape. Thank you, my dear, she said. You've been very helpful. As Clara left, Miss Marple stood alone in the library, her mind racing. The crumb, the letter, the vial all pointed to a carefully laid plan. But whose? And why? She thought of her old friend Mrs. Cleet, the postmistress, who might recall a letter with a bold hand and a London postmark. And she thought of that R, a signature that could belong to anyone or no one. The web was tightening, but the spider remained hidden. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple left the library, determined to unravel the next thread. Chapter 7. Tangled lies and hidden truths. Late morning light filtered through the tall windows of Blackthorn Manor, casting long shadows across the morning room where Inspector Craddock continued his interviews. The air was heavy with unspoken accusations, and the guests, confined to the manor, moved with the restless unease of caged birds. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting bag at her side, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her needles lay still, but her mind was anything but piecing together the fragments of Eleanor Vance's death. The poisoned coffee, the burned letter, the vial of cyanide, and that curious white crumb on the saucer. Inspector Craddock, his notebook now a tapestry of scribbled details, was questioning Mrs. Lydia Prescott, whose sharp tongue had softened into a guarded wariness. Mrs. Prescott, he said, his tone firm. You mentioned last night that you heard rumors about Miss Vance's past in London. Can you be more specific? Mrs. Prescott's lips tightened, her eyes flicking to the other guests. Rumors, Inspector, are just that, rumors. I heard in the village that Eleanor had associations before she came to St. Mary Mead. A man, perhaps, or some financial trouble. I don't deal in specifics, only what's whispered. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Mrs. Prescott's vagueness was deliberate, she thought, a way to cast suspicion without committing to details. She made a mental note to press further, perhaps through the village grapevine, where Mrs. Cleet, the postmistress, might shed light on those London connections. Craddock turned to Charles Haverford, who sat slumped in a chair, his face haggard. Mr. Haverford, you were engaged to Miss Vance. Did she ever mention these associations? Or any debts? Charles's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with anger. Eleanor was honest with me, he said, his voice tight. She told me. She had a past, yes, but nothing shameful. A debt, perhaps, from her time in London. But she said it was settled. She wanted a fresh start here. His voice broke, and he looked away, his hands clenched. Miss Marple noted the tremor in his voice, the way his gaze avoided Clara Dunham, who sat nearby, twisting her handkerchief. Clara had mentioned Eleanor's worry about a debt, and now Charles confirmed it. The burned letter, with its fragments of debt and promise, loomed larger in Miss Marple's mind. She thought of the signature, R, and wondered if it pointed to Roland Finch, whose calm demeanor seemed almost too perfect. As Craddock moved on to question Dr. Simon Caldwell, Miss Marple slipped quietly from the room, her destination, the village post office. The walk to St. Mary Mead was brisk, the autumn air sharp against her cheeks. The post office, a small stone building nestled between the bakery and the vicarage, was presided over by Mrs. Cleet, a woman whose memory for letters rivaled Miss Marple's own for village gossip. "Good morning, Mrs. Cleet," Miss Marple said, stepping into the cozy, paper-scented room. "I wonder if you might help me with a small matter. A letter was delivered to Blackthorn Manor yesterday, addressed to Miss Eleanor Vance. A white envelope, I believe, with a bold hand. Might you recall it?" Mrs. Cleet's eyes lit up, her love of local intrigue evident. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do remember that one. Came in the Morning Post, from London." The handwriting was a man's, I'd wager strong, with a flourish on the V for Vance. No return address, but the postmark was definitely London, EC1 district. I handed it to Grayson myself when he collected the Manor's post. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "And did Grayson collect any other letters that day? For Mr. Finch, perhaps, or Dr. Caldwell?" Mrs. Cleet frowned, consulting her ledger. "Nothing for Mr. Finch. But Dr. Caldwell had a letter, too. Same postmark, London EC1, though the writing was different, smaller, neater. I thought it odd. To London letters in one day for the Manor. Thank you, Mrs. Cleet," Miss Marple said, her mind racing. 2 letters from London, one for Eleanor, one for Caldwell. The web was growing more intricate, and she suspected the threads led back to Blackthorn Manor. Returning to the Manor, Miss Marple found the atmosphere even more strained. Craddock had finished his morning interviews and was conferring with Constable Harris about the laboratory results. The vial from Eleanor's room was indeed cyanide, and traces had been found in the coffee cup, though not in the pot itself. The sugar bowl's residue was still under analysis, but the spoon's white powder matched the vial's contents. The crumb on the saucer, however, remained a mystery. Its composition was not yet identified. Miss Marple approached Clara Dunham, who was sitting alone in the drawing room, her eyes red from crying. "Miss Dunham," she said gently, "you and Miss Vance were close. Did she ever speak of Dr. Caldwell? Perhaps a professional connection from London?" Clara's eyes widened, and she hesitated before answering. "Not exactly, Miss Marple, but she did mention once that she'd seen a doctor in London, someone who helped her with nerves. She didn't say his name, but she seemed grateful to him. Almost too grateful, I thought." Miss Marple nodded, her mind connecting. It's Dr. Caldwell's letter from London, his nervous demeanor, his quick identification of cyanide. Could he have known Eleanor before St. Mary Mead? And if so, why had he not mentioned it? As the day wore on, Miss Marple observed the guests closely. Roland Finch, ever the solicitor, spent much of the morning in the library, ostensibly reviewing papers for Lady Beatrice. But Miss Marple noted his frequent glances at the side table where the coffee cup had been. Lady Beatrice herself seemed distracted, her usual composure fraying as she snapped at Grayson over a minor delay in luncheon. Charles, meanwhile, had withdrawn into a brooding silence, his grief tinged with something Miss Marple suspected was fear. At luncheon, served promptly at 1 p.m., the conversation was stilted, punctuated by Mrs. Prescott's barbed remarks about secrets in London and hasty engagements. Miss Marple, eating her soup with quiet deliberation, let the words wash over her, noting the reactions: Charles's clenched jaw, Clara's flushed cheeks, Caldwell's sudden cough. The letter, the debt, the cyanide doll pointed to a motive rooted in Eleanor's past, but the means and opportunity remained elusive. As the meal ended, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need to rest. In truth, she returned to the library, where the saucer still sat, overlooked by the police. She examined it again, her fingers hovering over the crumb. It was not a crumb at all, she realized, but a tiny fragment of compressed powder. Perhaps a tablet crushed underfoot. A tablet of cyanide, she thought, ground into the sugar bowl to disguise its presence. But by whom? And how had it reached Eleanor's cup alone? The afternoon promised more interviews, and Miss Marple knew the truth was close hidden in the lies that were beginning to unravel. She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once said that a murderer's greatest mistake was believing they could outwit the truth. In Blackthorn Manor, someone had made that mistake, and Miss Marple was determined to find them. Chapter 8. The crack in the Fecka afternoon at Blackthorn Manor dragged on with a heaviness that seemed to seep into the very walls. The clock in the morning room struck 2:30 p.m., its chimes a somber reminder of the hours ticking by since Eleanor Vance's death. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, though her needles remained untouched. Her eyes, sharp and observant behind her spectacles, followed the movements of the guests as Inspector Craddock continued his methodical questioning. The discovery of the cyanide vial, the burned letter, and the mysterious crumb had tightened the net of suspicion, yet the truth remained tantalizingly out of reach. The morning's interviews had yielded little new information, but Miss Marple sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a crack in the carefully maintained facades of the guests. Charles Haverford's grief had hardened into a sullen defensiveness, his answers to Craddock clipped and evasive. Mrs. Lydia Prescott's sharp tongue had grown reckless, her comments laced with insinuations about Eleanor's past. Roland Finch, the solicitor, maintained his polished calm, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on the door, as though anticipating an escape. Dr. Simon Caldwell, meanwhile, seemed increasingly agitated, his spectacles slipping down his nose with every nervous gesture. Clara Dunham, however, was the one who drew Miss Marple's attention most keenly. The young woman had been quiet throughout the day, her handkerchief a crumpled knot in her hands, her eyes red and swollen. But there was something in her posture, a rigidity, a flicker of resolve that suggested she was holding something back. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beneath the surface, suspected Clara knew more than she had revealed. As Craddock took a brief pause to confer with Constable Harris, Miss Marple approached Clara, who sat alone by the window, staring out at the garden. "Miss Dunham," she said gently, settling beside her, "you've had a dreadful shock, haven't you? Losing such a dear friend. It must be hard to speak of it, but sometimes sharing a burden lightens it. Did Eleanor ever confide in you about someone troubling her?" Clara's hand stilled, her knuckles widening around her handkerchief. She didn't say much," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But yesterday, in the garden, she was so upset about that letter. She said it was from someone she thought she'd left behind, someone who wanted something from her." Clara's voice broke, and she looked away, her eyes filling with tears. Miss Marple's tone remained soft, almost maternal. "Someone from London, perhaps? A man, you said before. Did she give a name?" Clara hesitated, her lips trembling. She mentioned a name once, weeks ago. Richard. She said he was someone she'd known in London, someone who'd lent her money. But she swore it was over, that she'd paid him back. I didn't think it mattered until the letter." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Richard. The R on the burned letter fragment. It could be Roland Finch, she thought, though his polished demeanor seemed at odds with the bold, aggressive handwriting Mrs. Cleet had described. Or perhaps another R, a shadowy figure from Eleanor's past. "Thank you, my dear," she said, patting Clara's hand. "You've been very brave." As Clara dabbed at her eyes, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the timeline. Eleanor had received the letter yesterday morning, burned it by the afternoon, and died by 9:15 p.m. The cyanide, confirmed in her coffee cup, had been administered between 8:30 p.m., when the coffee was served, and 9:15 p.m., when she collapsed. The crumb on the saucer, the powdery residue on the spoon, the sugar bowl all pointed to a deliberate act, but the opportunity remained elusive. The drawing room had been full of guests, the tray accessible to all, yet only Eleanor's cup had been poisoned. Craddock, returning from his conference with Harris, announced that the laboratory had completed its analysis of the sugar bowl. "No cyanide in the sugar itself," he said, addressing the room. But the spoon's residue was indeed cyanide, ground into a fine powder. Someone tampered with it, likely intending it to be stirred into a cup. A murmur of shock rippled through the guests. Charles's face paled, and he muttered, "Who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Prescott's eyes narrowed, her gaze sweeping the room. Roland Finch remained impassive, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw. Dr. Caldwell coughed, adjusting his spectacles for the umpteenth time. "And the crumb on the saucer?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild but pointed. "Has it been identified?" Craddock frowned, clearly unused to her persistent questions. "Not yet, Miss Marple. The lab's still working on it. It's not cyanide, though some kind of compressed powder, possibly a tablet. We're cross-referencing it with known substances." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A tablet, crushed into powder, perhaps mistaken for sugar. It was a clever method, but one that required precision and proximity. She thought of Grayson, the butler, who had served the coffee but claimed to have returned to the kitchen. She thought of Dr. Caldwell, whose knowledge of cyanide was suspiciously precise, and whose letter from London suggested a hidden connection. And she thought of Clara, whose grief seemed genuine but whose hesitations hinted at secrets. As the afternoon wore on, Craddock called Dr. Caldwell for a private interview. Miss Marple, lingering near the door, overheard fragments of their conversation. "You received a letter from London yesterday, Dr. Craddock said. Care to explain its contents?" Caldwell's voice was strained. It was personal. A colleague asking about a medical matter. Nothing to do with Miss Vance. And yet, Craddock pressed, "You knew her in London, didn't you? She consulted you, professionally." There was a long pause. "Yes," Caldwell admitted finally. "She came to me last year, for nerves. I prescribed a mild sedative. That was all." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A sedative, she thought. Could it be linked to the crumb, a tablet, perhaps, mistaken for something else or deliberately used to mask the cyanide? She made a mental note to ask Craddock about the lab results when they arrived. As Caldwell emerged, looking shaken, Miss Marple caught Clara's eye. The young woman was trembling, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she whispered, pulling her aside. I need to tell you something I didn't want to say before, but Eleanor was afraid of someone here. She wouldn't say who, but she said she felt watched, even in the manor. I think she knew something was going to happen." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her voice remained calm. "Thank you, Clara. That's very important. Did she say anything else? Anything about the night of the dinner?" Clara shook her head, tears spilling over. "Only that she didn't trust everyone, she said. She said the manor had secrets, and she wished she'd never come." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miss Marple patted Clara's arm, her mind weaving the new thread into the pattern. A letter from Richard, a debt, a fear of being watched. The crack in the facade was widening, and Miss Marple knew that someone in Blackthorn Manor was about to break. She resolved to watch closely, for in that moment of weakness, the truth would surely emerge. Chapter 9. The tightening afternoon at Blackthorn Manor grew oppressive. The October sun obscured by a veil of gray clouds that mirrored the mood within. The morning room, where Inspector Craddock continued his relentless questioning, was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of secrets unspoken. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly near the window, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes missing nothing. Clara Dunham's whispered confession that Eleanor had felt watched, feared someone in the manor had sharpened Miss Marple's focus. The pattern was emerging, but the final threads remained elusive. Inspector Craddock, his notebook now a labyrinth of notes, was questioning Lady Beatrice, whose composure was beginning to fray. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his tone measured. "You were adamant last night that no one left the drawing room before Miss Vance went to the library. Are you certain of that?" Lady Beatrice's silver hair gleamed in the dim light, but her hands betrayed her unease, twisting the lace of her handkerchief. "Quite certain, Inspector," she said, her voice sharp. "We were all together, discussing the engagement. Eleanor excused herself at about 9 p.m. to fetch a book. No one followed her." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Lady Beatrice's certainty was too absolute. She thought, too rehearsed. She recalled Grayson's brief absence during dinner at 7:42 p.m., Dr. Caldwell's flushed return, and the coffee tray left unattended in the drawing room. Someone, she was certain, had found an opportunity to tamper with Eleanor's cup. Craddock turned to Roland Finch, who sat with his usual solicitor's calm, though Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "Mr. Finch," Craddock said, "you were discussing estate matters with Lady Beatrice last night. Did you notice Miss Vance's behavior? Anything out of the ordinary?" Finch's eyes flicked briefly to Lady Beatrice before he answered. She seemed preoccupied. "Perhaps, but I was focused on my conversation with Lady Beatrice. I didn't notice her leave the room." Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their quiet clicking, paused. Finch's answer was smooth, but his glance at Lady Beatrice suggested a shared understanding or perhaps a shared secret. She made a mental note to probe further into the estate matters Finch had mentioned as Craddock moved on to Charles Haverford. Miss Marple slipped quietly from the room, her destination the kitchen. She had a question for Grayson, whose role in serving the coffee made him a pivotal figure in the evening's events. The kitchen was a bustle of activity, with maids preparing tea under Grayson's watchful eye. The butler, seeing Miss Marple, straightened, his expression guarded. "Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "I wonder if you could clarify something for me. The coffee tray last night, you said Miss Vance took her own cup. Did you prepare the tray yourself in the kitchen?" Grayson nodded, his hands clasped tightly. "Yes, madam. I prepared the pot and cups as usual. 6 cups, all clean, and the coffee freshly brewed. I carried the tray to the drawing room at 8:30 p.m. "And the sugar bowl?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes keen. "You filled it yourself?" "Yes, madam," Grayson replied, though his voice faltered slightly. "From the kitchen stores. I didn't notice anything unusual." Miss Marple smiled, her tone disarming. "Of course. And after you left the tray in the drawing room, you returned to the kitchen immediately?" Grayson hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. I stepped out briefly to check the dining room, madam, to ensure the table was cleared properly. I was gone only a moment." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the admission. A moment, she thought, was all it would take. She thanked Grayson and returned to the morning room, where Craddock was now questioning Dr. Caldwell. The doctor's nervous demeanor was more pronounced, his fingers fumbling with his spectacles. As he spoke, "You admitted to knowing Miss Vance in London, Dr. Craddock said, his tone sharp. "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" Caldwell's face flushed. "It didn't seem relevant, Inspector. She was a patient, nothing more. I treated her for nervous exhaustion last year. I had no reason to think it connected to her death." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Caldwell's explanation was plausible, but his agitation suggested more. She thought of the letter he had received from London, the same postmark as Eleanor's. Could there be a link, a shared acquaintance, perhaps, or a shared secret? As the interviews concluded, Craddock announced new findings from the laboratory. "The crumb on the saucer," he said, addressing the room, "has been identified. It's not cyanide, but a fragment of a medicinal tablet, phenobarbital, a sedative. Traces were also found in the sugar bowl, mixed with the cyanide powder." A gasp rippled through the room. Charles's face paled, and Clara's hands flew to her mouth. Dr. Caldwell's spectacles slipped entirely, and he caught them clumsily. Miss Marple's mind raced. Phenobarbital, a sedative, possibly the one Caldwell had prescribed for Eleanor in London. But how had it ended up in the sugar bowl? And why? "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I suggest checking Miss Vance's medical history? If Dr. Caldwell prescribed phenobarbital, it could explain the tablet, but its presence in the sugar bowl is curious." Craddock nodded, making a note. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I want everyone's movements from 8:30 p.m. to 9:15 p.m. mapped out. No one is above suspicion. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts circling the new clue. Phenobarbital in the sugar bowl, cyanide on the spoon, a burned letter from Richard. The net was tightening, but the motive remained unclear. She thought of Clara's revelation about Eleanor's fear, her sense of being watched. Someone in the manor had known Eleanor's secrets and had acted to silence them. Miss Marple approached Charles, who stood alone by the fireplace, his face drawn. "Mr. Haverford," she said gently, "you loved Miss Vance, didn't you? Did she ever speak of someone named Richard? Someone who might have threatened her?" Charles's eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he said, his voice low, "She mentioned a Richard once, a man she'd known in London. She said he was trouble, but she'd handled it. I didn't press her, I trusted her." His voice cracked, and he looked away. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the threads together. Richard, a debt, a letter, a sedative, cyanide. The pieces were falling into place. But one question lingered. Who had the opportunity and the nerve to place the poison in Eleanor's cup? She resolved to watch closely for the next slip. The next crack would surely reveal the truth. Chapter 10. The gathering stormed. Late afternoon light cast long, wavering shadows across the drawing room of Blackthorn Manor, where the guests had been summoned by Inspector Craddock for what he called a reconstruction of events. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of Eleanor Vance's death pressing down on the assembled company. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The phenobarbital in the sugar bowl, the cyanide on the spoon, the burned letter with its cryptic R. Each clue was a thread in the intricate tapestry she was weaving, and she sensed the pattern was nearing completion. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook in hand, his expression stern. "We're here to go over last night's events," he announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Miss Vance died at 9:15 p.m., poisoned by cyanide in her coffee. The tray was served at 8:30 p.m., and she left for the library at 9 p.m. I want to know exactly where each of you was during that half hour." Lady Beatrice, seated in a high-backed chair, straightened her spine, her silver hair gleaming. "This is absurd, Inspector," she said, her tone icy. "We were all in this room, as I've told you. No one left until Eleanor did." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "So you say, Lady Beatrice, but we've established the coffee tray was tampered with cyanide on the spoon, phenobarbital in the sugar bowl. Someone had opportunity." He turned to Grayson, who stood rigidly by the door. "You, Grayson, you served the coffee. Did you see anyone near the tray after you left it?" Grayson's face remained impassive, though Miss Marple noted the slight twitch of his fingers. "No, sir," he said. "I placed the tray on the side table and returned to the kitchen. As I said, I was there until I heard the scream." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Grayson's story had shifted slightly. He now claimed to have stayed in the kitchen. Yet earlier he had admitted to checking the dining room. A small inconsistency, but one that could mean everything. Craddock turned to Charles Haverford, whose haggard face betrayed a sleepless night. "Mr. Haverford, you were with Miss Vance most of the evening. Did you see her take her coffee?" Charles nodded, his voice hoarse. "She took it herself. Black. No sugar. She always did. I didn't notice anything wrong." His eyes darted to Clara, then away, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of guilt in his expression. Clara Dunham, pale and trembling, spoke without prompting. I was with Eleanor when she took her cup, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She seemed fine, just quiet. I didn't see anyone near the tray. Her handkerchief twisted in her hands, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided Dr. Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell, adjusting his spectacles nervously, was next. I took my coffee with sugar, he said, his voice unsteady. I didn't notice anything unusual about the tray. I was talking to Mrs. Prescott most of the time. Mrs. Lydia Prescott snorted, her sharp eyes glinting. Talking to me, were you? I seem to recall you stepping away for a moment, Doctor. Just before Eleanor left for the library. Caldwell flushed, his hands fumbling. I went to the cloakroom. Briefly. A matter of moments. Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their quiet clicking, paused. Another absence, she thought. At a critical time, she glanced at Roland Finch, who had remained silent, his solicitor's composure unshaken. Mr. Finch, she said softly, drawing all eyes to her. You were discussing estate matters with Lady Beatrice. Did you have occasion to approach the coffee tray? Finch's eyes met hers, cool and calculating. No. Miss Marple, he said smoothly. I took my coffee early and remained with Lady Beatrice. I had no reason to go near the tray. Craddock, growing impatient, clapped his hands. Right, let's reconstruct this. Grayson, bring a tray with cups, exactly as you did last night. We'll walk through the sequence. Grayson complied, fetching a silver tray with 6 cups, a coffee pot, and a sugar bowl. He placed it on the side table, mimicking his actions from the previous evening. The guests, under Craddock's direction, took their positions as they had been at 8:30 p.m. Lady Beatrice and Finch near the sofa. Charles and Eleanor represented by Constable Harris by the window. Clara and Mrs. Prescott near the fire, and Caldwell moving between groups. Miss Marple watched closely as Grayson poured the coffee, noting the moment when Eleanor took her cup. The tray remained on the table, unattended for a brief period as Grayson stepped back. It was then Miss Marple realized that the opportunity had arisen. Anyone could have approached the tray. Caldwell, returning from the cloakroom, Charles, standing nearby, even Clara, whose nervous movements might have masked a quick gesture. As the reconstruction ended, Craddock's frustration was evident. Someone tampered with that tray, he said, his voice rising, and someone in this room knows more than they're saying. It was then that Clara broke. Her handkerchief fell to the floor, and she let out a choked sob. I can't keep it in any more, she cried, her voice trembling. Eleanor told me something that night. Something terrible. She said she'd seen someone in the manor, someone she recognized from London. She wouldn't say who, but she was terrified. She said they'd threatened her over the debt. The room fell silent. Every eye on Clara. Charles's face drained of color, and Caldwell's spectacles slipped again. Lady Beatrice's hand tightened on her chair, and Finch's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Miss Dunham, this is very important. Did she say anything else about this person? A name, perhaps, or what they looked like? Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She only said it was someone here, someone we all know. She said they wanted something from her, something more than money. Craddock seized the moment. Right? That's enough. I want everyone to write down their exact movements from 8:30 p.m. to 9:15 p.m., down to the minute. No more evasions. As the guests dispersed to comply, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind racing. Clara's revelation had shifted the pattern. Eleanor had recognized someone tied to her London past, someone who had threatened her. The letter, the debt, the all pointed to a motive rooted in fear and secrecy. The phenobarbital in the sugar bowl suggested a connection to Caldwell, but the cyanide on the spoon pointed to a deliberate act, one requiring both opportunity and intent. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the tray, still on the side table. The sugar bowl, the spoon, the cups, all innocent objects, yet one had carried death. She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once said that a murderer's greatest weapon was the assumption of innocence. Someone in this room, she was certain, was hiding behind that assumption. The storm was gathering, and Miss Marple knew the truth was about to break. Chapter 11. The unraveling thread. Drawing room of Blackthorn Manor was suffused with a tense hush. As the late afternoon light faded into a somber dusk, the clock on the mantelpiece showed 4:30 p.m., its steady ticking a counterpoint to the nervous energy that crackled among the guests. Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar corner, her knitting bag untouched, her keen eyes scanning the room. Clara Dunham's tearful outburst had cracked the veneer of civility, revealing a web of fear and suspicion. Eleanor Vance's recognition of someone from her London past, someone who had threatened her, had shifted the puzzle's focus, and Miss Marple sensed the solution was near. Inspector Craddock, his patience wearing thin, stood before the assembled guests, holding a stack of handwritten statements. "I've reviewed your accounts of last night's movements," he said, his voice sharp, "and there are inconsistencies. Someone is not telling the full truth." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Dr. Simon Caldwell, whose nervous fidgeting had grown more pronounced. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the reactions. Charles Haverford's clenched fists, Lady Beatrice's rigid posture, Roland Finch's carefully neutral expression, and Mrs. Lydia Prescott's sharp intake of breath. Clara, still shaken from her confession, sat with her head bowed, her handkerchief a sodden knot. The revelation of Eleanor's fear, coupled with the burned letter and the poisoned coffee, had tightened the noose of suspicion around them all. "Dr. Caldwell," Craddock said, turning to the physician, "your statement claims you were in the drawing room from 8:30 p.m. until Miss Vance's collapse, except for a brief visit to the cloakroom at 8:50 p.m. Yet Mrs. Prescott says you were gone longer than you claim, closer to 5 minutes. Care to explain?" Caldwell's spectacles slipped, and he pushed them up with a trembling hand. I may have lingered, Inspector," he stammered. "I felt unwell, a touch of indigestion. I needed a moment to compose myself." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Indigestion, she thought, was a convenient excuse, especially for a doctor who had prescribed phenobarbital to Eleanor in London. She recalled the crumb on the saucer, identified as a fragment of a phenobarbital tablet, and the cyanide on the spoon. The two substances, mixed in the sugar bowl, suggested a plan both calculated and desperate. Craddock turned to Grayson, the butler, who stood rigidly by the door. "Grayson, you claim you returned to the kitchen after serving the coffee at 8:30 p.m., but you told Miss Marple you checked the dining room. Which is it?" Grayson's face paled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I misspoke, sir. I did step into the dining room briefly to ensure the table was cleared. I was back in the kitchen by 8:35 p.m. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Grayson's shifting story was a thread she intended to pull. The coffee tray, left unattended, had been accessible to anyone in the drawing room and to Grayson, who had been closer than he admitted. Before Craddock could press further, Mrs. Prescott spoke up, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is all very well, Inspector, but what about the letter? It points to someone, doesn't it?" I'd wager it's Mr. Finch, with his London connections and his secretive estate business. Finch's eyes flashed, though his tone remained calm. Mrs. Prescott, I assure you, I had no correspondence with Miss Vance. My business here is with Lady Beatrice, and it's entirely above board. Lady Beatrice nodded, her expression regal but strained. Mr. Finch is correct, Inspector. He's been advising me on the manor's finances. Eleanor had no part in that. Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their quiet rhythm, paused. The estate finances, she thought, could be a motive. If Eleanor's engagement to Charles threatened the manor's future, perhaps by altering an inheritance or exposing a debt, it might explain the urgency to silence her. She made a mental note to inquire about the Haverford estate's status. Craddock, undeterred, held up the burned letter fragment. This letter, he said, mentions a debt and a promise, signed with an R. We've traced the postmark to London. EC1 District. Dr. Caldwell, you received a letter from the same postmark yesterday. Care to share its contents now? Caldwell's face flushed scarlet. I told you, Inspector. It was from a colleague, about a medical matter. Nothing to do with Miss Vance. Then you won't mind if we verify that, Craddock said, signaling to Constable Harris. We're sending an officer to London to check with the post office and your colleagues. Caldwell's shoulders slumped, and Miss Marple noted the resignation in his posture. He was hiding something, she was certain, but whether it was guilt or shame remained unclear. As Craddock continued, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the timeline. Coffee served at 8:30 p.m. Eleanor's departure to the library at 9 p.m. Her collapse at 9:15 p.m. The cyanide, fast-acting, had been in her cup. But the phenobarbital in the sugar bowl suggested a secondary plan, perhaps to sedate her, to ensure she drank the poisoned coffee without resistance. The crumb, a fragment of a tablet, implied carelessness or haste. Someone had crushed a phenobarbital tablet, perhaps intending to mix it with the cyanide, but had left a trace on the saucer. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Clara, who had been silent since her outburst. Miss Dunham, she said gently, drawing the young woman's attention, you said Eleanor felt watched. Did she ever mention seeing someone near the coffee tray that night? Clara's eyes widened, and she hesitated before answering. I don't know, Miss Marple. She was nervous, but she didn't say anything specific. I saw her take her cup, and I thought I saw someone move near the tray afterward. But it was so quick. I couldn't be sure. Who? Clara? Craddock pressed, his voice sharp. Clara's voice trembled. I think it was Dr. Caldwell. He was near the table when he came back from the cloakroom. But it was dark, and I wasn't certain. Caldwell's face drained of color. That's preposterous, he cried. I was nowhere near the tray. The room erupted in murmurs, and Miss Marple's mind raced. Clara's hesitation suggested uncertainty, but her accusation was a turning point. The net was tightening, and someone was about to snap. She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once said that a murderer's greatest fear was exposure not of their crime, but of their true self. Miss Marple watched Caldwell closely, noting the sweat on his brow, the tremor in his hands. The thread was unraveling, and she knew the truth was moments away from breaking free. Chapter 12. The trap is set. Drawing room at Blackthorn Manor seemed to pulse with an unspoken dread as the clock struck 5 p.m., its chimes echoing like a warning. The guests, summoned once more by Inspector Craddock, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a gallery of fear, defiance, and calculation. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in her corner, her knitting bag at her side, observed the scene with her characteristic calm. Clara Dunham's accusation against Dr. Simon Caldwell had ignited a spark, and Miss Marple sensed that the truth, so long obscured, was about to be forced into the open. Inspector Craddock stood at the center of the room, his notebook replaced by a stern resolve. "We're close to answers," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. Miss Vance was poisoned with cyanide, delivered through her coffee. Phenobarbital was found in the sugar bowl, and a fragment of a tablet on her saucer. Someone in this room tampered with the tray, and I believe someone knows who. His eyes lingered on Dr. Caldwell, whose nervous fidgeting had escalated into a visible tremor. Caldwell rose, his spectacles glinting in the fading light. "This is outrageous," he protested, his voice cracking. "I've told you, Inspector. I was nowhere near the tray when I returned from the cloakroom. Clara must be mistaken." Clara, her face pale, clutched her handkerchief. I only said what I thought I saw," she whispered, her eyes darting to Miss Marple as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tension. "Miss Dunham, you've been very brave," she said. "But let us be precise. You saw Dr. Caldwell near the tray at around 8:50 p.m., just before Miss Vance took her cup to the library. Could anyone else have approached it?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I suppose anyone could have. The room was dimly lit, and we were all moving about, talking. But I noticed Dr. Caldwell because he seemed agitated. Caldwell's face flushed scarlet. "Agitated? I was unwell, as I said. This is slander." Craddock raised a hand for silence. "Enough. We've established the timeline. Coffee served at 8:30 p.m. Miss Vance took her cup around 8:50 p.m., left for the library at 9 p.m., and collapsed at 9:15 p.m. The cyanide was in her cup, and the phenobarbital suggests a plan to sedate her first. Dr. Caldwell, you prescribed phenobarbital to Miss Vance in London. Did you bring any with you here?" Caldwell's hands shook as he adjusted his spectacles. I always carry a small supply for emergencies, but I swear, I didn't touch the sugar bowl." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The phenobarbital, she thought, was a distraction, a red herring meant to point to Caldwell. The cyanide, fast-acting and precise, was the true weapon. She recalled the burned letter, the bold handwriting, the London postmark, and Clara's mention of Richard. Her gaze drifted to Roland Finch, whose calm demeanor had begun to crack, his fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "might I suggest a small experiment? Let us place the coffee tray on the table again, exactly as it was last night. Sometimes, seeing a thing in its place reveals what was out of place." Craddock, though puzzled, nodded. "Grayson, set up the tray as you did at 8:30 p.m. yesterday." Grayson, his face a mask of professional detachment, complied, arranging the silver tray with 6 cups, a coffee pot, and the sugar bowl. The guests watched, their tension palpable. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and approached the tray. She pointed to the sugar bowl, its lid still slightly askew. "This bowl," she said, "was tampered with. The phenobarbital was meant to confuse us, to suggest a sedative was the goal. But the cyanide on the spoon that was the true poison, placed in Miss Vance's cup alone." Lady Beatrice's voice was sharp. "Miss Marple, are you accusing someone here?" "Not accusing, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple replied, her tone serene. "Merely observing. The spoon's residue suggests someone handled it after Grayson left the tray, and the crumb on the saucer, a fragment of a phenobarbital tablet, implies haste or carelessness. Someone meant to sedate Miss Vance, perhaps to ensure she drank the poisoned coffee without resistance. Charles Haverford's voice broke the silence, raw with emotion. Who would do this to her? She was going to be my wife. His eyes, red-rimmed, fixed on Caldwell, then Finch. As if seeking a culprit, Miss Marple's gaze settled on Finch. "Mr. Finch," she said softly, "you were near the tray when you took your coffee. You've been advising Lady Beatrice on the estate's finances. Did Miss Vance's engagement to Charles threaten those plans? A marriage, after all, can shift inheritances." Finch's composure wavered, his jaw tightening. "I had no reason to harm Miss Vance," he said, his voice steady but strained. "My work here is purely professional." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "And yet, a letter from London, signed R, mentioned a debt and a promise." Mrs. Cleet at the post office described bold handwriting, a man's hand. Could that be Roland? The room froze. Finch's face paled, and for the first time, his polished facade cracked. "That's absurd," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Craddock seized the moment. "Mr. Finch, we've sent an officer to London to trace that letter. If it's yours, we'll know soon enough. Care to save us the trouble?" Finch's hands clenched, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. She spoke again, her voice calm but relentless. "Miss Vance recognized someone here, someone from her past. She was afraid, Mr. Finch. Afraid of you, perhaps. A debt she owed, a promise she couldn't keep." Finch stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is nonsense," he cried. "I barely knew her, but Miss Marple's trap was set." She turned to Craddock. "Inspector, might I suggest searching Mr. Finch's room? If he wrote that letter, there may be evidence stationery, perhaps, or a draft." Craddock nodded, signaling to Constable Harris. "Do it. Now." As Harris left, the room erupted in murmurs. Lady Beatrice's face was ashen, Charles's hands shook, and Clara's tears flowed anew. Caldwell, visibly shaken, muttered something about needing air. Miss Marple remained still, her mind racing. The trap had been sprung, but the true culprit, she suspected, was not yet fully exposed. The letter, the poison, the fear all pointed to Finch, but the phenobarbital suggested another hand, another motive. The storm was breaking, and Miss Marple knew the final revelation was imminent. Chapter 13. The breaking point. Drawing room at Blackthorn Manor was a crucible of tension, the air thick with the weight of accusation and fear. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 5:30 p.m., its chimes sharp against the silence that followed. Miss Marple's suggestion to search Roland Finch's room. The guests, seated in their uneasy semicircle, exchanged furtive glances, each waiting for the next crack in the facade. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag untouched at her side, sat, with her hands folded, her eyes bright and unyielding behind her spectacles. The trap she had set was closing, but she knew the final revelation required one last push, a moment of pressure, to force the truth into the open. Inspector Craddock, his face set in grim determination, stood by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on Roland Finch. The solicitor's polished composure had frayed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his jaw tight. "Mr. Finch," Craddock said, his voice low but commanding, "Constable Harris is searching your room as we speak. If you have anything to tell us about that letter, or Miss Vance's death, now is the time." Finch's eyes darted to Lady Beatrice. Then back to Craddock. I've told you, Inspector, he said, his voice strained but controlled. I had no connection to Miss Vance beyond this weekend. The letter is not mine. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Finch's. Denial was firm, but his glance at Lady Beatrice suggested a shared secret, perhaps tied to the estate's finances. She recalled Mrs. Cleet's description of the letter's bold handwriting and London postmark, and Clara's mention of Richard Finch's initials fit. But the phenobarbital in the sugar bowl pointed elsewhere, perhaps to Dr. Caldwell, whose nervous demeanor and London connection were equally suspect. Before Craddock could press further, Constable Harris returned, his face flushed with excitement. Inspector, he said, holding up an evidence bag, we found this in Mr. Finch's room, hidden in a briefcase. Inside the bag was a sheet of stationery, its quality matching the burned letter fragment, and a fountain pen with a distinctive gold nib. The paper's the same, sir, Harris continued. And there's a draft of a letter, unsigned, mentioning a debt and a promise. The room erupted in gasps. Charles Haverford leapt to his feet, his face contorted with rage. You, he shouted, pointing at Finch. You threatened her. You killed her. Finch's composure shattered. That's preposterous, he cried, rising from his chair. I wrote no such letter. Someone must have planted it. Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and imperious. Enough, Charles. Mr. Finch is my solicitor, not a murderer. This is a mistake. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The outburst, she thought, was revealing not just Finch's panic, but Lady Beatrice's quick defense. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. Inspector, might I suggest comparing the handwriting on the draft to the burned fragment? And perhaps Mr. Finch could explain why such a letter was in his possession. Craddock nodded, his eyes narrowing. We'll do that. Harris, get the fragment for comparison. He turned to Finch. Anything to add, Mr. Finch? Finch's face was ashen, his hands trembling. I did write a letter, he admitted, his voice barely audible. But it wasn't to Miss Vance. It was to a client in London, about a financial matter. I don't know how it ended up in my briefcase here. Miss Marple's needles, though still, seemed to hum with her thoughts. A client in London, she thought, or a convenient lie. The stationery matched, but the handwriting would tell the tale. She turned her attention to Dr. Caldwell, whose agitation had reached a fever pitch. His spectacles were askew, his hands twisting in his lap. Dr. Caldwell, she said gently, you seem distressed. Is there something you wish to share about Miss Vance, perhaps, or the phenobarbital in the sugar bowl? Caldwell's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. I've told you everything, he cried. I prescribed phenobarbital for her in London. Yes, but I didn't poison her. I cared for her more than I should have. His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. The room fell silent, the weight of his confession settling over the guests. Clara gasped, her handkerchief falling to the floor. Charles's face darkened, and Mrs. Prescott's lips curled in a knowing sneer. Lady Beatrice's hand tightened on her chair, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's mind raced. Caldwell's admission of feelings for Eleanor was a new thread, one that explained his agitation and perhaps his silence about their London connection. But did it explain the phenobarbital? Or the cyanide? She thought of the timeline. Coffee served at 8:30 p.m. Eleanor's cup taken at 8:50 p.m. Her collapse at 9:15 p.m. The tray, left unattended, had been accessible to all but Caldwell's. Absence at 8:50 p.m. placed him near the tray at the critical moment. Craddock seized on the confession. "You cared for her, Doctor," he said, his voice sharp. "Enough to be jealous of her engagement to Mr. Haverford. Enough to poison her?" Caldwell's head shot up, his face a mask of horror. "No, I would never harm her. I only wanted to protect her. She was frightened. She told me so in London. She said someone was pressing her for money, someone named Richard." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Finch, then back to Caldwell. To men, to confessions, both tied to Eleanor's past. The letter, the debt, the fear all pointed to a motive rooted in London. But the act had happened here, in the manor. She spoke again, her voice calm but piercing. "Inspector, the phenobarbital suggests a plan to sedate Miss Vance, perhaps to make her vulnerable to the cyanide. But the cyanide was the true weapon, placed in her cup alone. I wonder, did anyone see Dr. Caldwell or Mr. Finch near the sugar bowl before Miss Vance took her cup?" Clara's voice, trembling but clear, broke the silence. I saw Dr. Caldwell near the tray, as I said, but I also saw Mr. Finch pass by it, just after he took his coffee. He brushed against the table, and I thought I heard something fall." Finch's face drained of color. "That's a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I never touched the tray." But Miss Marple saw the truth in his panic, the way his eyes darted to the door. The net was closing, and the breaking point had been reached. She knew the final revelation was moments away, and she prepared to pull the last thread, ready to expose the murderer in their midst. Chapter 14. The final revelation. Drawing room at Blackthorn Manor was a stage set for truth, its heavy curtains drawn against the encroaching dusk, the lamplight casting stark shadows across the faces of the gathered guests. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked toward 6 p.m., each chime a step closer to the unraveling of Eleanor Vance's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting bag untouched, her eyes sharp and steady behind her spectacles. The confessions of Dr. Simon Caldwell and Roland Finch had cracked the facade, and Clara Dunham's faltering accusation had tightened the net. Now, Miss Marple knew, the moment had come to lay bare the truth. Inspector Craddock, his patience, worn thin by evasions and half-truths, stood at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the guests. "We've heard enough contradictions," he said, his voice firm. "A letter from London, cyanide in a coffee cup, phenobarbital in the sugar bowl, and a murderer among us. Someone in this room poisoned Miss Vance, and I intend to know who now." Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Inspector, if I may, I believe we can reconstruct the truth by examining the small details, the threads that weave the pattern. Let us begin with the coffee tray." She rose, her movements deliberate, and approached the silver tray, still arranged as it had been the previous night. Miss Vance took her cup at 8:50 p.m. Black, no sugar, yet her saucer held a fragment of a phenobarbital tablet. The sugar bowl contained traces of phenobarbital, and the spoon bore cyanide. This suggests a plan both complex and desperate. The guests shifted uneasily. Charles Haverford's face was pale, his hands clenched. Lady Beatrice's lips were a thin line, her eyes darting to Finch. Dr. Caldwell adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling. Clara Dunham clutched her handkerchief, her eyes wide with fear. Roland Finch, his composure shattered, stood rigid, as though bracing for a blow. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. The phenobarbital was a distraction, meant to suggest a sedative was the goal, perhaps to point to Dr. Caldwell, who, prescribed it to Miss Vance in London. But the cyanide was the true weapon, placed in her cup alone. The question is, who had the opportunity, and why? She turned to Finch, her eyes piercing. Mr. Finch, you wrote a letter to Miss Vance, did you not? A letter signed R, demanding repayment of a debt. Mrs. Cleet at the post office described bold handwriting, a man's hand, from London's EC1 district. The stationery found in your room matches the burned fragment. Finch's face drained of color. I told you, it was to a client, not Miss Vance, he protested, but his voice cracked, betraying his panic. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were relentless. You knew Miss Vance in London, Mr. Finch. She owed you money, a significant sum, I suspect, tied to her past. Her engagement to Charles threatened your leverage, didn't it? A married woman, backed by the Haverford wealth, might never repay you, so you acted. Finch shook his head violently. No, I didn't poison her. Miss Marple turned to the tray, pointing to the sugar bowl. The phenobarbital was a clever touch, meant to mislead, but the cyanide on the spoon, that was your mistake. You brushed against the tray, as Clara saw, and in your haste, you left a crumb of the crushed tablet. You meant to sedate her, to ensure she drank the poisoned coffee, but the cyanide was your true intent. Lady Beatrice rose, her voice trembling with indignation. Miss Marple, this is absurd. Mr. Finch is my solicitor, a man of integrity. Miss Marple's eyes met hers, calm but unyielding. Lady Beatrice, you knew of Mr. Finch's dealings, didn't you? The estate's finances were precarious, and Miss Vance's marriage to Charles could have exposed them, or worse, shifted the inheritance. You defended Mr. Finch because his actions protected your interests. Lady Beatrice's face paled, and she sank back into her chair, silent. Charles's voice broke the stillness, raw with anguish. Is this true, Aunt Beatrice? Did you know, Miss? Marple continued, her voice steady. Dr. Caldwell, you cared for Miss Vance, perhaps too much. Your letter from London, your nervousness, it suggests you knew of her troubles, but you did not act. Your guilt is one of omission, not commission. Caldwell's shoulders slumped, his face buried in his hands. I loved her, he whispered. I knew she was in trouble, but I didn't know how to help her. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Finch. Mr. Finch, you saw your chance. When Grayson left the tray unattended, you crushed a phenobarbital tablet, mixing it with the sugar to confuse the investigation. Then, with a sleight of hand, you dusted cyanide onto the spoon, knowing Eleanor would take her coffee black and stir it herself. The crumb was your error, a trace of the tablet, left on the saucer when you brushed the tray. Finch's eyes widened, his voice rising in desperation. You have no proof. The letter, the stationery, it's circumstantial. Craddock stepped forward, holding the burned fragment and the draft from Finch's room. The handwriting matches, Mr. Finch, and the lab confirmed the cyanide on the spoon was identical to a sample found in a vial in your briefcase, hidden beneath the stationery. The room gasped. Clara sobbed, and Charles lunged toward Finch, only to be restrained by Constable Harris. Finch staggered back, his face a mask of defeat. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he stammered. She owed me thousands, and she laughed it off. She said the engagement would erase it all. I lost control. Miss Marple nodded, her expression somber. You lost more than control, Mr. Finch. You lost your humanity. Craddock signaled to Harris. Take him into custody. As Finch was led away, his protests fading, The room fell into a stunned silence. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her work done, the pattern was complete. A debt, a letter, a moment of desperation, and a poison delivered with cold precision. The truth, as always, had been in the details: the crumb, the spoon, the fear in Eleanor's eyes.